Hi, buddy. There you go. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming to my talk tonight. I'm really excited to talk to you all about truffle dog training and some of the awesome stuff that I've found thanks to Rye. So first off, a couple introductions. Of course, already got introduced. Heather Dawson. I'm a PhD student, but my love and interest for truffles started long before I ever considered going into a graduate program. My sister Hillary Rose and I would go out in the woods and we would follow the dogs around, and they started finding all kinds of cool stuff. So we got really interested in what else is out there beyond just the culinary truffles. And so this started with Cricket, my first truffle dog. I learned a lot through her, and we kind of explored the whole truffle thing together. I was a total amateur when I started training her, so it was a process. But then she helped me train Rye, who you see here today. He's my second truffle dog. And I also got a puppy recently who I'm training exclusively on all the great stuff that Rye finds. And that's Pyro. And he loves to find truffles, but he also loves to eat truffles. So that's one of my current challenges. So a little outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. First part is going to be focused on the truffle dog training. Part 2, a little bit about what truffles are and what they're doing out there. And then part 3, I'm going to walk you through some of the great Pacific Northwest truffle diversity we have around here. So truffle dog training. Why would someone want to hunt truffles with a dog? Well, I feel like this picture speaks for itself. This was me with Cricket, the time that it finally really clicked for her how to find truffles. And so I was over the moon, and so is she. We were just having a blast together. So ever since then, I've been totally in love with it. And I think everyone, if they want to, should be able to experience the joy of finding truffles with a dog. And I get asked a lot how I got into truffle dogs and truffle dog training. So for the longest time, I was really planning on being a dog trainer. I started out with a love for dogs, a love for training dogs, but of course, I've also been, curious about fungi my entire life and really wanted to learn more about them. So when I moved to Oregon and I learned that Oregon had wild truffles and I had just gotten my first dog, I was like, this is perfect. This is exactly up my alley. I'm going to train my dog to find truffles. So I started Cricket with truffle oil because I didn't have any connections in the truffle world. I was like, how do you do this? You look online and people are selling oil. So I got oil from the Truffle Dog Company based in Seattle. They make it specifically with the Oregon white and black truffles infused, better than the stuff you can buy on the shelf because those are not our truffles here. So I would hide little truffle bits in the woods for Cricket to find, and she did great. And every single time I went out, I would keep hoping, maybe today she'll find me a real truffle. Maybe today she will. She wasn't really doing that. We still had fun, but I was getting impatient. And in 2016, she was about a year old. She did find her first wild truffle. I went out to a known truffle patch thanks to a wonderful person at the Bureau of Land Management who had designed a truffle dog permit to combat all the raking that was happening. So he was trying to help people do the right thing with their dogs. And so we went to this patch. I was stoked. She found her first wild truffle. And then a couple years went by of nothing and nothing. And I was not giving up hope because truffles were my dream. And then I don't know how many of you were out hunting fungi in 2019, but 2019 was an incredible year for mushrooms. And so I took her back to the same spot and it just totally clicked. She found a couple, and then after that she was off and she was obsessed with finding black truffles from that point on. And I also started taking her out to spots that didn't have culinary truffles to see what else she could find because I was curious. I was like, what else is out there? And she started digging up things that didn't match in my mind of either an Oregon white truffle or an Oregon black truffle. And that's when I learned that there's more than just those two species out there. We actually have hundreds of species. They're not necessarily valuable to us from a culinary perspective, but they're doing the exact same thing. They're out there producing aroma, attracting forest animals to come and find them. And so I was in a mycology class at the time when Cricket started finding some other stuff, and I had the means to figure out what those things were. And so this was one of the first ones that she found that opened my eyes to what else is out there, and I was able to essentially key it out to the species called Hydnotria tuasnae, which I had never heard of until she found it. So I started thinking a little bit more about what's out there and what I could learn about them. And then I got rye. I got rye in the summer of 2020, so not too many truffles out there, but I trained him on some frozen black truffle pieces I had in my freezer, and he was pretty good. But he really started to shine when truffle season rolled around in October, and I took Cricket out, and she would find the truffles for him in the woods, and I could show him exactly what that looked like as he would approach the truffle smell. You know, he would be rewarded for that. And I could also have Cricket find the general spot and then tell her to wait. So then I could point to that specific spot and say, hey, Rye, there's a truffle right here. Why don't you look here? And so he picked it up instantly. You know, the years that it took me to train Cricket was just a matter of days with Rye. It was really easy. So honestly, I think that's the best way to train a truffle dog, but it's a little harder to do if you don't have access to a truffle dog. But Rye kind of went further than that. You know, sometimes I'd take Cricket out and she might find me something odd, but it turned out that no matter where I went with Rye, he was finding all kinds of cool stuff. He couldn't turn off the truffle nose. So he started out with things that were kind of similar to the truffles he'd smelled before. So Genia, the ones right there with the kind of hollow interior, those were some of the first ones that he started finding because they smell a lot like white truffles. And then he also branched out to some other tuber species. So tubers are a true truffle genus, but there's also a whole bunch of other species that aren't good for culinary purposes, but still have that kind of strong tuber smell. And then one time he found this fist-sized truffle in the middle of the trail that smelled just like banana bread. And my sister and I were like, what the heck is this thing? And so we brought it home and we figured out it was a Gardieria truffle. And all this time, you know, he's finding all these things that even some of them he would find, and I wouldn't know until later that they were actually rare species of truffle that are really hard to find, like Fissurella subcaulis and this endangered Rhizopogon species. But it was really exciting. You know, I learned through him just how much was out there and the fact that truffles are in pretty much every forest you go to. You just have no idea that they're there because they're hidden underground. And so when I got Pyro, I was like, I'm going to capitalize on the fact that I have a dog who finds all kinds of aromas. So ever since I brought Pyro home, I've been showing him those odd smelling truffles in the location of the forest. And he's done really great. He was able to diversify pretty early on. As I mentioned, he's kind of a truffle connoisseur himself. So sometimes he finds me a truffle and he wants me to throw the ball, and sometimes he finds the truffle and he's like, no, I'll just eat that myself, thanks. But he's a good dog, he really is. I didn't bring him because he's young and bouncy. He's a lot of fun, but he's Rye's protege, essentially. And that all leads me to the fact that you really can train any dog to find truffles. There's no single breed of dog that's better than another. But the key thing is your dog has to be motivated by something. If you don't have something that they want that you can pair with a truffle scent, it's going to be hard to train your dog. Not impossible, but hard. But for Rye, like that thing is a ball. For many dogs, it's treats. But really, whatever you can pair that kind of gets them going, you can train old dogs, young dogs, you know, slow dogs, fast dogs. It doesn't matter. But step one, choose your reward. And that's based on your dog specifically, not what someone says online. Figure out what they like very best. Usually fresh foods like cheese, liver treats, hot dogs are going to get them going more than, say, kibbles or biscuits. But also a ball is great if you have a ball dog. And then step two is going to be introducing that truffle odor in a familiar environment. So take the truffle scent, whether it's oil or a frozen piece or fresh truffle, and just show it to your dog. And the instant they show any interest, give them a reward marker like yes or good, and then give them a treat. And then do that multiple times. They'll pick it up super quickly. Then you can put the truffle on the ground. As soon as they go for it, do the same thing. Yes, good dog, give them a treat. They're going to also think that's a great game. And then you can start hiding it around the house. At that point, you know, they'll be running around, having a blast. And once they're confident at that, you can start moving outside. Moving outside can be where you start seeing some difficulties in the dog's understanding of the game. So if the dog doesn't understand the game, you can always move backwards and go back inside. I recommend going to a familiar outside area before going to the forest if you don't know specifically whether there's truffles in that forest or not. A backyard area or a park isn't going to have as many competing fungal aromas. So the forest, as you can imagine, to a dog, just has this, incredible bouquet of fungal aromas that they have to tell apart from the truffle scent. Your backyard, probably not quite as much unless you live in the forest, which good for you if you do. But then once you're finding stuff in the backyard, then you can move on to the forest and see if they can find truffles in there. A couple of tips that I noticed when I was training cricket is it's really easy to train your dog to find your scent. So if you pick up the truffle, you walk around the yard and dig a couple holes and put it in, the dog is just going to be following where you went. So it's good to keep in mind that when you're out there, walk in zigzags and use a tool to kind of dig a hole. And then also when you're out in the forest, put flagging tape kind of up on the tree somewhere so you know where to find the truffle. I've lost quite a few T-balls in the forest by hiding truffles in them and then forgetting where to put them. And cricket's like, I don't know where that is. Anyway, day's long gone, but a couple of things you can do. And you may run into some problems along the way. It's not always, doesn't always go without a hitch. Sometimes what you'll see is dogs that are just kind of dig happy. So they'll just walk around, dig a hole, and move on. And you're like, is there a truffle there or not? Sometimes that means the dog is confused about what behavior is leading to the reward. They think maybe the digging behavior leads to the reward, but you want to make sure they understand that it's the finding the truffle that gets the reward. So making sure you're exact with your praise, that once they sniff the truffle, as the nose goes towards the truffle, that's when they get the reward. And honestly, it's a learning experience for them, so they may be just guessing, which means you don't want to be making a big deal out of each hole. If they're not interested, you can dig around yourself, but don't pressure your dog too much or it's going to stop being fun for them. And you want to make sure it's always fun and easy. Probably the biggest issue is that your dog is easily distracted or disinterested in truffle scent. The forest is a really exciting place for dogs. There's all kinds of other things they would rather be doing than sniffing for truffles. So you're going to want to simplify, make sure it's really easy for them. You can bring it down to only asking for one find at a time. So you can use a start and finish cue to say, okay, we're going to truffle now, help them find the truffle, say, yes, good dog, okay, all done, and then they can go play. And then you do it again, but keep it easy for them and let them have breaks. It's never wrong to going backwards, practicing in the house and backyard will just kind of help solidify that training before you go to the harder forest area. And sometimes all you have to do is find a higher value reward. So the treats that your dog thinks is the best thing at home might not cut it in the forest. You might have to up your game and go get some steak or something. And also, this happens a lot. Some dogs have no interest in eating truffles, and other dogs think they're absolutely delicious, just like we do. A couple of things you can do. One is just be faster than your dog. If you give them time to think about, I have a truffle, what am I going to do with this truffle? There's a good chance they're going to try eating it, and then they might develop a taste for truffles. It can be useful to practice with truffle pieces in a container so that they can practice getting close to the truffle scent, but not being able to actually eat it. And sometimes you just have to accept that there is going to be a truffle tax because they're out there finding truffles and they like them just like you do. So, the number one thing to remember is don't scold your dog. If they're going for the truffle and you start scolding them, they're going to be like, hey, this isn't fun anymore. I'm not going to find truffles. So it is what it is. There's things you can do to discourage them from eating it, but remember it's a game and they like truffles just like we do. So, and as I mentioned, in my experience, I do feel like the best method is finding someone with a trained truffle dog and then bring your dog out so they can follow that dog around. And if it works for them, have their dog find, dogs will start to indicate when they're finding a truffle. Have their dog, stop once they've indicated the truffle, and then you can point out to your dog, that's a truffle right there. Because a truffle growing wild that hasn't been disturbed yet by humans smells completely different than the one that you pull out and dig around. So that's ideal. Of course, not everyone has that capability, and you can absolutely train your dog without that. I did cricket. It just took me a little while. And that gets to where can you find truffles? Well, most truffles are mycorrhizal, which means they're in a root symbiotic relationship with tree hosts. So around here we have quite a few trees that do this. Primarily our Douglas fir trees host a lot of truffles, also oak trees. And some truffles have high host specificity where they're only with one certain tree host, and others are generous, and you can find them with several. But if you want to look for truffles, look for the trees. So as I mentioned, oak habitat is good, and conifer habitat is also great. Our culinary truffles are going to be found in conifer habitat, but specifically this is conifers in the pine family. So trees like Douglas fir, hemlock, pine, and spruce. Don't bother trying to find truffles under trees from the cypress family, which includes their western red cedar, incense cedar, redwoods, and juniper. And also broadleaf trees like maples and ash are not ectomycorrhizal, so they're not going to have these truffles under them, and yew as well also. So yeah, stick to conifers if you're looking for culinary truffles, and oaks have other cool stuff, but probably nothing you want to eat. And so as I mentioned, our culinary truffles are found with Douglas fir. And in fact, the very best habitat to be finding culinary truffles happens to be Douglas fir plantations. So you've probably seen this kind of forest when you're driving around. It's not that, beautiful, multi-dimensional old growth forest, but it just so happens that Oregon white and black truffles love this habitat, and they can be super prolific. And generally, if you look at the ground and notice that it's either absent of any ground cover or has predominantly sword fern as ground cover, that's a great indication of truffle habitat. Same thing with kind of mossy areas. It should be fairly damp. So yeah, just start, if you notice this area, you can check it out. It's up to you to make sure that the land use regulations allow you to harvest truffles. Of course, private land is the best way to go. A lot of public land does not allow it, but it's a kind of a tricky scenario. So I advise you to read up on that before you go out harvesting truffles. And of course, you don't have to use a dog. I highly discourage anyone from harvesting truffles for commercial purposes with a rake, but for your own use, you can absolutely go out and dig around a little bit. You want to look for rodent signs for finding truffles, because they're out there looking for the truffles as well, and they'll leave these little holes. And if you check with your finger that it doesn't actually tunnel down, it's very likely it's a truffle hole. So there's sort of these cone-shaped areas with a little pile of fresh dirt around it. And if you gently lift the duft around these holes, you can sometimes find the truffles that they didn't find. There's a good chance that they're not going to be mature because the rodents are going for the aromatic ones. But you may get lucky. They don't always get everything. But be mindful of your impact if you're using a rake, and make sure that you replace the duff and ensure no tree roots are exposed when you leave. So talked a lot about truffle dog training and how to find truffles, where to find truffles, but what are truffles exactly? In simple terms, a truffle is an underground mushroom. So as you know, mushrooms come up from the ground and they carry the spores that allow that fungus to reproduce. Truffle is doing exactly the same thing. It just doesn't actually come up above ground. It does that entirely in a fruiting body below ground. So truffle anatomy is a couple of terms here, but pretty simple. This spore mass is contained inside in the gleba, and that's typically, in a true truffle at least, between these veins or folds. And then the outside, the covering of those spores, is called the peridium. And so a lot of times these truffle spores are ornamented with warts or spines, which gives them a little extra protection for going through the gut of a small mammal, which is their ultimate goal. And so why would you want to be a truffle? Well, there's a few reasons. This right now feels pertinent because it's cold and snowy outside, but going underground offers protection from the elements. So as a mushroom, you're exposed to a lot of challenges when you're above ground. Mushrooms need water to produce their fertile spore-bearing surface. And when it gets really cold, that's challenging for them. And also when it dries out, that's really challenging for them. But truffles are buffered by living in that soil layer. So this is just a little graph of soil and ground level temperature data for March, which can be kind of a tricky month for being a mushroom because it's variable in temperature. Sometimes it freezes, sometimes it warms up. And you can see that middle line there, the teal one, is the soil temperature at 2 inches below the surface. And then the darker blue line below that is the ground temperature, which is regularly dropping below 30 degrees. But the soil temperature doesn't even drop below 40. So it's a lot easier if you're going to be a mushroom producing a fruiting body to live in the soil. And also, it offers a unique and different way to disperse your spores. So this is a photo of a cup fungus that is just sitting on the ground, and then I blew on it, which produced some wind, and it produces this puff of spores into the air. And that's how most above ground things disperse their spores, on the wind. But a lot of times those spores don't even make it further than 3 meters away from the fruiting body. You know, a couple of them will, but most of the spores don't actually go very far. But truffles have a potential to go quite far because they're relying on animals to spread their spores. And animals are quite active and they can move very long distances. And so a truffle, while it may not have as high of a chance of dispersing its spores, if it is successful, it can go quite a lot further. So they rely on these mycophagists, which is literally means fungi eaters. A lot of times animals like voles, squirrels, really popular, but also tinier things like invertebrates. A lot of the black truffles that we find are full of these little fungus beetles that specifically target fungi. And they like the smell of the truffle as well. And maybe a beetle doesn't go very far, but it might be eaten by something else that moves really far. So truffles have the opportunity to go quite long distances. And so, of course, this comes down to the aroma. In order to be found by wildlife, truffles produce unique aromatic compounds. And so we recognize this because a few of these aromas we are very fond of for culinary uses, like the Oregon brown, black, and white truffles. But as I mentioned, we actually have hundreds of truffle species here. And there's a reason we don't have hundreds of truffle species on the menu. A lot of these are not producing aromas that we find interesting, but something else out there does. And of course, as you know, when you're out looking for mushrooms, mushrooms can be quite fragrant too. Some of them, you know, it's a range of aromas. There's this stinking earth fan, which smells quite awful. And then matsutake has a very distinct, particular cinnamon or stinky socks aroma. Aniseed fungal mushroom smells really strongly of anise. There's this almond scented rusula, which smells kind of interestingly of almonds. Candy cap, of course, that's a famous one that smells like maple. I don't know if you've ever found this wonderful pink bubblegum mushroom, Aphroditeola. It smells very strongly of tutti frutti bubblegum. But the curious thing about all these fragrant mushrooms is that Rye doesn't recognize them. He has no interest. It can be as strong of a mushroom as you want. To him, it's not truffle aroma. So the truffles are producing some other compounds that says, hey, I'm a truffle. And those aromas are all over the map. I mean, of course, we have the, more horseradish and garlicky smell. That's a genia up there, but also that's the smell that you get from a white truffle. But then we also get weird stuff like rotting onions, almonds and bubblegum, Earl Grey tea. I mean, I get creative with these names because you smell it for, a second and you're like, that reminds me of something. Aromas all over the map. And all these smells, I trained Rye on Oregon white and black truffles. He does all this on his own. He generalizes these. So there has to be some kind of hidden unifying aromatic compounds that he's identifying as a truffle, which is kind of cool. And that's, one of the powers of being a dog is they're able to pull apart these aroma components, whereas to us, we just smell the whole suite of it at once. So with all these truffles out there, if you do find one, how do you know what you found? It can be a challenge because many truffles can't be identified to species without looking under a microscope. You need to see their spores. But even that is quite tricky because your chance of finding an undescribed species is really quite high. I've run into this quite a bit myself, and if you go through the keys and you have an undescribed species, that's not going to help you. But there are a few tricks. First one I recommend you do is take a picture and post to iNaturalist. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, it's a great way for any IDs for anything growing wild. So plants, animals, mushrooms, truffles. And we have a Truffles of North America project. So if you find a truffle and take a picture of it and post it to that project, there's a good chance that I or some other truffle person will give you an identification. A good ID is going to include photos of the outside, the pyridium. You want to slice it in half to show the inside or the gleba. Of course, spores are great, but not required. Most people don't have access to a microscope. A scale bar can be useful to see the size. Honestly, I just use my hand as a scale mark most of the time because, we all have hands within the same range. And vegetation is also great to mention because some truffles are specialists with certain trees. And then odor can also be a great one to mention as well if your truffle has odor. And with all these different species out there, some people wonder if there are poisonous truffles that they have to watch out for. In general, I say, while most truffle species technically aren't harmful if consumed, we really don't know the true edibility of most because, as I mentioned, there's so many different species. We just haven't explored all of them. And some of them come from lineages of other mushrooms that we know are not edible. So it's kind of, I would say exercise caution. What you can do is infuse with those truffles if you want. So an infusion is just putting it next to whatever, usually fatty food item you have. It doesn't touch it at all, but the truffle will impart its aroma into that fatty food, and that should be safe. You don't have to worry about experimenting with that, but I would not recommend experimenting eating all these different species. The two you really have to watch out for are the toxic mushroom buttons that can be found underground if you're just digging around. So Amanita mushrooms will produce this button stage that looks kind of like a puffball or something that's like a mushroom. If you cut it open, you can usually see that mushroom shape in there. Be very cautious of those. And then the biggest one is the false truffle scleroderma. Those are often popping up out of the soil. When they're very mature, they produce a powdery inside, but when they're young, if you cut them open, they're actually white on the inside and could be confused for a truffle. Those will make you very sick. So don't eat those. Highly recommend not going down that path. But they can actually smell quite good. So that's one cautious thing. Rye doesn't find them. They're not a truffle in that sense. They don't produce truffle aroma, but the ones that I've found smell actually pretty pleasant, mushroomy, but pleasant. So be aware of what that one looks like. All right, so let's get into a little bit of the Pacific Northwest truffle diversity. And now this isn't going to be everything because it would take us all night, but it's kind of, a few highlights of the stuff that I find a lot or find very interesting. And of course, the true diversity and distribution of most truffle fungi remains largely unknown because they're so hard to find. When you look out in the forest, you can see with your eyes the mushrooms, you can see the crust fungi on the logs, you can see this coral fungi coming up, but you can't see the truffles, so you don't know where to look for them. And that means we know a lot less about truffles than we do about other fungal species out there that are a little easier to see. And also, full credit where credit is due. I'm actually quite terrible at finding truffles. I don't know how to find truffles. All the truffles that I find are thanks to Rye. And so he just naturally picked up this ability to find truffles regardless of the species, regardless of the odor. And he has this magical ability to generalize. And so it's through him that I found all this great stuff that you're going to see in the following slides. And one little side point is that most truffle research has been done using rakes so far. So using dogs to find all this fungal diversity is fairly unheard of, at least in North America. They've done it a little bit in Europe. But there's kind of advantages and disadvantages to both. So I think the biggest pros for using a dog is the fact that they don't have color or size bias. So when you're using a rake, you're using your eyes to look for truffles, and the ones that are brightly colored or large are going to pop out to you. Dogs don't care what it looks like, so they'll find teeny tiny little things that look just like the soil. As long as it has odor, they're going to find it. And along with that, you're only going to be getting the mature truffles. So when you're looking with a rake, again, truffles often take a long time to mature. So you're going to often be finding the immature ones, which don't have spores that you can check to see what species it is. And probably the best thing about a dog is that they can precisely target that odor and cover really enormous areas, eliminating a lot of the guesswork that you have to do when you're using a rake. Of course, there are some cons, including the time it takes to train a dog and the fact that not every dog out there is suited for finding truffles. One that I run into a little bit is you have to be mindful of their vulnerability to environmental hazards. So especially heat. Rye honestly struggles to find truffles at 65 degrees and up just because when he's running around, he's panting. And he's not going to be sniffing truffles as well when he's panting. So he does great in cold temperatures. I definitely have to watch out asking him to look for truffles when it's warmer. And also things like rattlesnakes, which I recently discovered is kind of a thing if you go south of Oregon. You have to think about that because the rattlesnakes are hiding in these little holes and the dog is sniffing around with their nose. So A dog, you have to think a little bit more about where you bring them and what conditions they're facing while they're looking for truffles. Whereas a rake, obviously, you can take a rake out in any weather, any dangerous situation. If you think is it a snake over there, you can just check with your rake. If it gets bitten, it'll survive. So yeah, rakes are really easy to use. I think there's some potential for dogs to have an odor bias, just like we have a visual bias, where it's easier to see truffles. Dogs are probably going to prefer some strongly scented truffles over others. I don't think that's a big, reason not to use dogs because, of course, I've found an incredible number of things with rye, but that's something to keep in mind. So yeah, I think they're both totally valid methods, and dogs are probably slightly more efficient than rakes. But of course, rakes have been used for pretty much all of the knowledge that we have about Pacific Northwest diversity up until at least Rye entered the scene. So it's totally valid way. So all credit where credit is due for the raking folks. So when you find a truffle and you want to know what it is, the first major split you can make is deciding whether it's an ascomycete truffle or a basidiomycete truffle. And so you may have heard these terms or not. These are the two major fungal lineages that produce fungal fruiting bodies that we identify as like mushrooms or cup fungi. And so ascomycete truffles include the culinary tubers, our Oregon black truffle, and that group also includes morels and cup fungi, whereas basidiomycete truffles are from the group that's basically everything else. So mushrooms, crust fungi, corals, those are all basidiomycetes, and the truffles in that group have pretty much all evolved from some potentially familiar above ground form, like a regular mushroom shaped thing, or like the one in this picture from a coral shaped relative. And so I'll start a little bit with ascomycete truffles because these include the true truffles and they're in some ways the coolest, but let's not pass any judgments. I love ascomycete truffles just because they're beautiful and lovely. And here is a little diagram kind of showing how a truffle might evolve from an above ground cup fungus relative. So cup fungi, as we saw in that picture of the one dispersing its spores, they have their spores in these little sacs on this fertile spore bearing layer, and they eject those spores into the air when they're mature. But if conditions get really dry, it might be advantageous to start protecting that fertile spore-bearing surface from the elements. And to do that, one might start closing it in, as you can see in the middle image in B. And at that point, it's no longer advantageous to shoot your spores into the air because they have nowhere else to go. So you have to come up with another method to spread your spores, which is when they start producing that truffle aroma. So it's kind of this spectrum of transitioning from above ground to below ground. And on the left, there are some familiar ascomycete fungi you might have seen. So cup fungi, false morels, elfin saddles, and our delicious true morels. And then on the right, those are actually truffle relatives of each of these. So along these lineages, truffles have evolved many times. And most of these ascomycete truffles are in this main lineage called the Pisizales. So that's an order of fungi that includes the cup fungi, morels, truffles, and others. And within this, we have several families that include truffle-forming fungi as well as non-truffle-forming fungi. So like the Helvelaceae down here, that includes elfin saddles and the truffle genus Balsamia. The Morchellaceae includes our morels and some very valuable culinary truffles like Leucangium, Oregon black truffles, and Calipuia, the Oregon brown truffle. And then a whole bunch of others, including, of course, the true truffle star tuber. And so to walk through these, I'm going to start out with the classic truffles, those that have a solid or marbled gleba, including these three families. So tuber, of course, is the one that most people are familiar with. This includes the European truffles that if you go into the supermarket and you buy a truffle, it's probably a tuber that originated in Europe. We have quite a few here beyond the culinary Oregon white truffles. We have tuber gibosum there, which is the spring Oregon white, and below it tuber oregonense, which is our fall Oregon white, and then a whole bunch of other ones, including some oak associated, like the tuber candidum, tuber crassicula are both oak associates. And then those others can be kind of flexible with conifers or oaks. And these smell interesting, but you wouldn't necessarily want to infuse with them the way that we do with the Oregon white and black Oregon white truffles. And in that same family, there's one called Coiromyces. And this one you're less likely to find, but especially up around snowmelt, you can find Coiromyces alveolatus. It looks a lot like a tuber. The veins are a little bit more meandering, like the Coiromyces meandriformis over there. They kind of wander along, and they smell sort of tuber-like. So you could try infusing with this one, but I find it a little bit odd. But it's still a cool one to know about because it's our only other relative in the tuber family. And then this one, fairly easy to confuse for a tuber because it does have that sort of veined interior, but the veins never turn dark. So as you can see over here, all of these tuber species kind of have a mottled pattern in there with white veins with a darker tone to them. Balsamia always stays white, and it has this typically brick red peridium and kind of an odd odor like glue or putty. Also, because I work in a lab, I think it smells a lot like ethanol. It's interesting. Not a culinary truffle, but beautiful. Find this one a lot with oaks, actually, in Southern Oregon and California. And then, of course, leucangium, which many people are familiar with. This is the Oregon black truffle. It smells kind of like pineapple, chocolate, and coconut. It's actually a pretty good dessert truffle, honestly, whereas the Oregon white truffles really star in savory contexts. Oregon black truffles can be really good with like vanilla ice cream. Kind of odd to think about it if you haven't smelled them before, but trust me, it's good. And so we actually have two species here. We have Leucangium carthusianum, the black one, which is about to get a new name for specifically ours, because that's a European name, as has happened for a lot of different fungi. And then also we have one that's kind of pink on the outside. So it smells a lot like the black one, but it's got a pink exterior, and that one you can find often in the summer around here. And then there's the brown truffle, which is relative of Leucangium and has quite a particular aroma. So I have a story about this one with Cricket. That's Cricket with the first brown truffles she ever found. I had heard about brown truffles before I encountered them, and I was like, what could these smell like? I'm so curious what the Oregon brown truffle smells like, because people are like, this is a great culinary truffle. So I went out with some folks at a truffling foray. These people knew what they were doing. You know, they'd seen lots of truffles before. And Cricket found her first brown truffles. And I was so excited. I pulled it out of the ground and I gave it a sniff. I was like, oh no, the truffle's rotten, darn. Because sometimes you find truffles and they're a little past their prime. You know, the dogs recognize them because it still smells like truffle, but I was disappointed. So I handed it over to the foray leader and I said, I'm really excited to find these, but unfortunately they've gone bad. And he was like, oh no, these are perfect. And that was when I learned I'm not a fan of the Oregon brown truffle. So it's a fun one to find, but it really does smell rotten. Very rotten. Dogs love them. And then also in this family, the morel family, is this odd one called Fischerula subcaulis. It's the only species in the genus, at least in our area, and it looks exactly like a rock. I don't know how anyone ever found this before we were using dogs, because it's indistinguishable from rocks in the soil. And it even feels like rock. When you pull it out, it is rock solid. You know, when I'm looking around in Rye's digs for the truffles, I'll see something that's, is that a pebble? Is that a truffle? I'll pick it up and I'll squeeze it to see if it's truffle. If it squeezes, it's a truffle. If it doesn't, it's a rock. Well, these Fischerula have often failed my squeeze test multiple times. I have to go back and like, no, wait, is that really a truffle? They're that hard. But they're also kind of unusual because you can see that historical remnant of a stipe in there from theoretically what was a distant relative that was an above ground mushroom. So something probably like a morel. And then as this one moved underground, it never fully lost that stipe. So that's a really unusual trait to see in ascomycete truffle. There's quite a few basidiomycetes that do this, but that one's fairly unique. And so those were our solid truffles, and we're still in the ascomycetes and the Pisces, but there are a lot of these that just haven't quite completed the folding to produce a dense truffle fruiting body. These ones have hollows inside, and that includes Genia, which Rye likes to find, and a couple others. So genie is lovely. They're actually, I think they would have great potential as a culinary truffle, except they're so darn hard to find and they're often pea-sized. So you'd have to get a lot before it's worth it, but they can smell great. And there's an incredible number of undescribed species out there, most likely because they are incredibly hard to find. But this is fun. This is a fun one because you can find it pretty much anywhere you go in conifer forest. They're super common, and if you have a dog who knows how to find truffles, there's a good chance they'll target this one without being trained to. Geopera, you stand a much better chance of finding without a dog. These often are popping up out of the ground with pines. So if you have any area with ponderosa pines, you can find it. And this one's kind of unique because it actually still has the capability to forcibly discharge its spores like an above ground cup fungus. When you cut this one open, if you put it up to your face, you can literally feel the spores blasting at you. I've made the mistake of sniffing while they're doing that and ended up with a lung full of spores. But it's kind of interesting because it's rare to see that. And there are other members of this genus that are still existing just in the cup form. So it represents just how quickly they can transform into a truffle. And then there's Hydnotria. So this is a really common one to find in the spring and summer, especially up in the mountains. So this one is related to false morels. I wouldn't recommend eating it. Pyro has managed to eat it a few times and has been just fine. So theoretically, it's not poisonous, but I wouldn't recommend it. But this one can be just absurdly common up in the mountains, enough that I stopped rewarding the dogs for finding them because there's just too many. And then I have one other Ascomycete truffle to mention. This one is not in the Pisaziales group. It's not part of the group that includes cup fungi and morels. It's actually the closest relative to green and blue molds. So the kind of stuff you find on your citrus and bread when it's been sitting out too long, there's actually a truffle relative of those molds, and it's called Elaphomyces. And Elaphomyces is kind of interesting because it has this tough outside, but it also has a powdery spore mass on the inside. So similar to something like a puffball. And they can be super abundant in conifers. I mean, just really an incredible amount. There's been some raking studies that have quantified, practically tons of Elaphomyces out there. They're really productive. And if you're in forest, you'll usually see these two versions. There's the unmarbled Elaphomyces, which just has that white rind. And then there's the marbled ones where you can kind of see that marbling in there. Don't even attempt to get it to species because there's a whole bunch of undescribed ones out there. And so Elaphomyces is pretty unique because, as I mentioned, it has that powdery spore mass. And what it does is it produces this attractive aroma for rodents. That picture is when you can see the sort of the rodent tooth marks where it's been gnawing on the shell. So the general idea is, the squirrel will find the Elaphomyces truffle, dig it up, carry it over to a log or up in a tree where it eats it, kind of breaks open the truffle and leaves the spore mass there. And it's so light and fluffy that it'll just blow away on the wind. So it's kind of utilizing both the truffle form of attracting rodents and also the wind dispersed form of something you might see above ground, like a puffball. And this is so successful, it's also shown up a few times in Basidiomycete lineages as well. So it just shows how many different ways you can spread your spores as a fungus. So to conclude on Ascomycete truffle characteristics, those in the Pisaziales usually have a solid gleba with mottling or veins, or can have a folded gleba with hollows like the Genia. Texture is usually waxy or solid, and you're not going to find too many that are squishy. That's a pretty dense truffle is typical for an Ascomycete, except of course Elaphomyces, which is the odd one out, which has that really thick and tough outer shell, and the interior is a black powdery spore mass with no particular arrangement. And if your truffle doesn't fit those characteristics, it's probably a Basidiomycete truffle. Of course, always exceptions, but most Basidiomycete truffles are squishy, foam-like. They can be milky or have these gooey locules, and I'll show a few here. And of course, Basidiomycete truffles evolved from a lot of the things we see and recognize as above-ground mushrooms, and it's all over the place. So whereas the Ascomycete truffles were just in the Pisaziales order, the Basidiomycete truffles are in multiple different fungal orders. And this little diagram kind of represents the transition of how one might go from an above ground mushroom into a truffle. You just start folding in those gills and eventually moving underground. And a lot of these fit this general rhizopogon-like form. So rhizopogon is a really common one that you can find out in conifer forests, and it's just kind of this amorphous sort of folded mass. Not super interesting, but really common and hard to distinguish from some of these other ones. Those others include Hymenagaster and also the truffle forms of the Russula and Lactarius group. And so common traits between these are that they are often relatively squishy. The gleba, as you can see, is made of a bunch of these tiny folds, and the pyridium is generally quite thin, so there's no thick outer rind. And rhizopogon is probably what you're going to find if you go out in the forest and look around for truffles with a rake. They're incredibly common. There's a whole bunch of different species, and you know, sometimes they smell. Honestly, Rye doesn't find a lot of these, so many of them don't produce much aroma, but really easy to find, and you can recognize them by this kind of amorphous interior. Hymenagaster is a weird sort of planty smelling truffle, sort of melon, cucumber, spices. And if you go raking in a good like white truffle looking forest, there will also be Hymenagaster as well. And so this one is related to a group of mushrooms that's not considered edible, so I highly advise against eating this one, but it's good to be able to identify it. And then there is the Russula truffles. So they used to have their own truffle genus, but then we figured out they're not actually distinct from the above ground ones. So you might recognize that sort of pinkish purple Russula up there. That's what you see a lot in the fall around here. There's a whole bunch of truffles that are in that same group. They're not genetically distinct at all in the truffle form. They just happen to move underground pretty fast. And there's also the Lactarius version of that. So Lactarius and Russula are related. It's just Lactarius is the one that produces milk when you break it open. Same goes true for the truffles. There's actually a lot of Lactarius truffles out there. You cut them open and they'll make milk, just like you see with the mushroom form. They aren't always milky, so that makes it a little harder to tell them apart. But they're pretty interesting, and it just goes to show how quickly one can move from an above ground form to below ground. And then this is an odd one. If you're familiar with the genus Lepiota, this is actually a saprotroph mushroom or a wood decomposer. As I had mentioned, most truffles are ectomycorrhizal with trees. That is not the case for this Lepiota truffle. And it's incredibly rare. I've seen it once. It's only been found a handful of other times, but I thought it was pretty special because it's actually blue. It's like this blue-green truffle, which is totally wild, but kind of a fringe case of a truffle that's a wood decomposer rather than ectomycorrhizal. And so those are the sort of rhizopogon-like truffles, and then there's also quite a few that produce these sticky or milky locules. Some rhizopogon actually do this, but main ones are going to be Alpova. Melanogaster is the really black one there. Leucogaster has a white interior, and then there's also this unusual one called Favansia, which is an endangered truffle. So Alpova is going to be pretty easy to find if you go out to alder habitat. Those are often just popping out of the soil, and they don't even produce aroma, oddly enough, so Rye doesn't find them. But they're pretty gelatinous, and they have this kind of brown interior compared to their relative, Melanogaster, which has this dark, almost oily looking interior. Melanogaster smells extremely strong. It often has this harsh sort of paint or chemical aroma. Occasionally they're lovely and fruity, but most of them are overwhelming. Most of the time I share them with people, the reaction is like, oh, get that away from me. They're really, really strong, but common in conifer forests, so fairly easy to find. Leucogaster, a little bit more lovely smelling than the Melanogaster, but also very easy to find. These have a yellow pyridium and a wonderful aroma of banana and butterscotch. As I mentioned, this is Pyro's favorite truffle to eat, unfortunately. And I've learned that he can eat large quantities of them without suffering any ill effects, so that's good to know. But yeah, distinguished by this gleba of white milky locules. The riper they are, the more wet they are, so they get pretty juicy with age. And then there's this odd one called Favansia parentiaca, which is the only species in the genus Favansia, and is one of the few truffles to have been granted the classification of endangered, by the IUCN Red List. There's kind of an underrepresentation of fungi in our endangered species listings, but this truffle did get it, thankfully, because it's only found in high elevation Cascade Range forests, which are of course under threat by these megafires that are increasing in our recent years. So it's rarely found, and also its habitat is potentially greatly endangered. So it's hopeful to see finally some recognition for some truffle species, and exciting that Rye can help me find this one. So he's put quite a few extra locations on the map for this rare species. And then finally, we have truffles with this central branching columella. So that's kind of the inside that you see there. Hysterangium kind of has a gelatinous looking columella. Gaudiuria often has a white one. And then there's finally an odd little one called sclerogaster, which is pea-sized. So hysterangium is pretty easy to find also in conifer forest. It'll have this greenish inside. The aroma can be absolutely overpowering, like gaseous, nauseating, occasionally fruity, but overall not one you would want to interact with in any culinary sense. But you can usually identify it by that green inside and the fact that you can peel away this white peridium from the gleba. And then Gaudiuria, this is the one I mentioned that smelled like banana bread that Rye found. Not all of them smell like banana bread. Some of them smell like burning brakes. It's like really horrible chemical bad smell. So you kind of get both ends of the spectrum. Lots of unknown species here, but really pretty easily identified by that branching columella on the inside, and you can sort of see the remnant of a corofungus relative, and that's what they're most closely related to, is corofungi. And then, as I mentioned with the Lepiota, we do have another saprotrophic or wood decomposer truffle. This one is super tiny, but with a powerful aroma. It smells kind of like a sugary lemon bar, kind of eggy, but mostly lemony and really, really sweet. And I only find it in grass habitat. It's definitely an undescribed species that we have out here, and probably undescribed because no one thinks about looking for truffles in grasslands. So that's kind of a bonus. Not super common, but next time you see truffle digging out in the prairie, see if there's any sclerogaster out there. So finally, Basidiomycete truffle characteristics include usually softness, squishiness, more so than the Ascomycetes. They're usually lighter and less dense. They're more likely to produce some kind of milk or kind of gooey interior, and often they'll have that remnant stipe or columella branching up through them. But their characteristics are just all over the map because they have developed over many different lineages. So Rye, of course, has taught me all about these different truffles, and so I've kept a list of everything he's found. This is everything described that he's found, but he's found quite a few undescribed genera, so I include that into his count. So he's found around 50, and it's just been an incredible journey seeing all the stuff that he shows me. And so that's most of what I have for today, but of course, acknowledgements are due to my mycological mentors, which have helped bring me to where I am today, along with Rye. So a big thanks to those folks, and I'll take any questions.